My name is Sarah, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been a carefully constructed facade of perfection. On the outside, I have everything anyone could ever want: a charming house, a stable marriage, and a steady rhythm to my days. But perfection has its cracks, and I've lived in the shadow of those cracks for too long. You see, my husband Michael isn't a bad man. He's reliable, successful, and always provides. But as the years have passed, his attention has drifted elsewhere: work, colleagues, the endless demands of corporate life. Our conversations are mechanical, boiled down to logistics and pleasantries. Did you pay the electricity bill? What's for dinner? Don't forget your meeting tomorrow. It's not malicious neglect, but neglect all the same. I've become part of the furniture, unnoticed and unappreciated. This morning was no different. Michael left early, clutching his travel mug of coffee as he kissed my cheek on autopilot. His tie was slightly crooked, and his parting words, "Don't wait up for me," hung in the air as the door clicked shut. I stood in the silence of our pristine kitchen, staring at the empty space he'd left behind, feeling that familiar ache of invisibility. To distract myself, I decided to walk to the park. It's a habit I've picked up recently, a quiet rebellion against the monotony of my days. The fresh air helps clear my mind, the rustling leaves and distant laughter of children a gentle reminder that life still pulses around me. It was late morning when I reached Riverview Park. The sun filtered through the trees, dappled light playing across the path as I meandered through the winding trails. That's when I first saw him. He was leaning against a bench near the fountain, a book in his hand and an easy, relaxed energy that seemed to draw the light toward him. He looked young, maybe mid-20s, with sandy blonde hair that caught the sunlight and a ruggedness that felt effortless. For a moment, I thought he might be someone I'd seen in passing, but no, this man was unfamiliar, completely new to the bubble of my routine. I slowed my pace, careful not to look too obvious as my gaze lingered a little too long. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something magnetic about him, a quiet confidence that made him seem so at ease in the world. I envied it. My own steps felt heavy in comparison, weighed down by the invisible threads tethering me to my life of predictability. I turned down another path, trying to shake the strange sense of curiosity that had taken hold of me. Why had I noticed him at all? It wasn't as though I'd never seen a man before, but something about the way he seemed utterly content, absorbed in his book and the moment, made me feel like an intruder in my own life. When was the last time I'd felt that kind of stillness, that kind of ease? By the time I circled back to the fountain, he was gone. The bench was empty, save for a single fallen leaf clinging to the edge. The moment felt fleeting, insignificant, yet it lingered, echoing in the back of my mind as I walked home. The house was as I'd left it, neat, organized, and achingly quiet. I busied myself with the usual chores, scrubbing counters that were already clean and organizing the fridge for the third time that week. But no matter how much I tried to focus, my mind kept drifting back to him, the stranger in the park, with his book and his presence that seemed to fill the space around him. That evening, Michael came home late, his tie loosened and his phone glued to his ear as he rattled off details about some meeting he had tomorrow. He nodded at me in passing, barely registering my presence as he headed straight for his office. I stared after him, the weight of the day settling heavily on my chest. As I climbed into bed that night, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Longing, perhaps? Or maybe it was just the stark realization that my life, as secure and stable as it was, had become a series of small, empty rituals. The stranger in the park was nothing more than a passing shadow, a figment of my restless thoughts, and yet, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Maybe it was the way he seemed so alive in that moment, so completely present in a way I hadn't felt in years. Or maybe it was simply that he noticed the world around him, while I felt like I'd been sleepwalking through mine. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would bring some clarity. But instead, all I could see was the golden light of the park and the faint smile on a stranger's face. The next morning, I woke up with an unshakable restlessness. My dreams had been a hazy tangle of golden sunlight, the park, and the stranger's faint smile. I tried to dismiss it as the silly remnants of an overactive mind, but something inside me whispered that I should go back. Just to the park, I told myself. Nothing more. Riverview Park was quieter that day. A cool breeze had settled over the morning, rustling the leaves and carrying the distant hum of traffic. As I approached the fountain, I half hoped to see him again, and half hoped he wouldn't be there. It felt ridiculous to be searching for someone I didn't even know. But then there he was. He was seated on the same bench, his posture relaxed, one leg crossed over the other. This time, he wasn't reading but staring out over the fountain with an expression that was hard to read. Thoughtful, perhaps. Or wistful. Before I realized what I was doing, I found myself slowing down, my footsteps barely making a sound on the gravel path. Our eyes met and he smiled. Not the casual smile of a stranger acknowledging another, but something warmer, as though he remembered me too. "Good morning," he said, his voice light and inviting. "Back for another walk?" Caught off guard, I hesitated before answering. "Yes, I managed. It's a lovely day for it." He gestured to the open space around us. "It's the best place to clear your head, isn't it?" I nodded, taking a step closer, though I didn't sit down. There was a pause, but not an awkward one. Instead, it felt like the silence you share with someone when words aren't entirely necessary. Finally, he extended his hand. "Jake," he introduced himself. "Sarah," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, his palm warm against mine. We talked for a while about the weather, about the park, about little things that felt insignificant but somehow filled the space between us. Jake's presence was disarming. He had a way of making every word sound genuine, every glance feel intentional. I found myself laughing at a small joke he made about the fountain, my own voice sounding lighter than I'd heard it in ages. As we parted ways that day, I felt something unfamiliar bloom inside me. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a flicker of something deeper, something I didn't dare name yet. I told myself it was nothing. A stranger in the park wasn't going to change anything about my life. But Jake was there again the next day, and the day after that. Each time, our conversations grew a little longer, our words digging a little deeper. He told me about the books he liked to read, the places he'd traveled, and the quiet moments he cherished. I told him about my walks, about the small routines that kept me sane. I even mentioned Michael in passing, of course, but not with the warmth you'd expect from someone talking about their husband. If Jake noticed the lack of affection, he didn't comment. "You know," he said one afternoon, as the sunlight danced through the trees, "it's nice to talk to someone who really listens." His words caught me off guard. "Don't most people listen?" I asked, half joking. Jake shook his head. "Not really. Most people are just waiting for their turn to talk. But you pay attention. It's rare." I didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever said anything like it to me before. It made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. We fell into an easy rhythm after that. The park became our meeting place, though it was never planned. Some days, we would simply sit in companionable silence, letting the world move around us. Other days, our conversations would dive into unexpected depths, revealing fragments of ourselves that felt too personal and yet perfectly safe to share. "Do you believe people can find happiness again?" Jake asked me once, his tone unusually serious. I hesitated. "I think they can," I said carefully. "But maybe not in the way they expect." He smiled at that, a faint but genuine smile. That's a good way to put it. I wanted to ask what he meant, but I held back. We were both careful not to push too hard, to let the connection unfold naturally. And yet, with every passing day, it felt like there was something between us that neither of us could ignore. By the end of the week, I found myself looking forward to the park not just as an escape, but as a destination. Jake had become more than a stranger, more than an acquaintance. He was a presence, a quiet, steady presence that filled the empty spaces I hadn't even realized were there. And though I knew I shouldn't, I couldn't help but wonder where this path would lead. There's a fine line between friendship and something more, a line I once believed was clear and immutable. But with Jake, that line seemed to blur with every passing day. We began meeting more frequently, though we never called it that. I'd head to the park at the usual time, and he'd already be there, waiting. We'd talk about everything, his childhood memories, the dreams he'd once chased, and the moments that had shaped him. I'd find myself sharing things I'd never told anyone, pieces of myself I'd kept locked away. With Jake, it was easy. Too easy. One afternoon, we wandered further than usual, our steps taking us to a quiet corner of the park where the trees formed a dense canopy overhead. The sunlight filtered through in soft beams, dappling the ground in golden patterns. Jake paused by a weathered bench and gestured for me to sit. I hesitated, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite name, but I followed his lead. "You've got this way about you," he said, leaning back against the bench and turning to face me. "Like you're carrying the weight of the world, but you don't want anyone to notice." I laughed softly, trying to deflect. "Is it that obvious?" "To me, it is," he said, his voice low but steady. "Why do you hide it?" His question hit me like a blow. I'd spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, of blending into the background. The idea that Jake could see through all of that left me feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. "Habit, I guess," I said finally. "It's easier that way." "Easier, but not better," he replied, his gaze steady. "You deserve better, Sarah." My breath caught. The words were simple, but the way he said them, as if he truly believed them, made my chest ache. Michael had never said anything like that, not in years. I wasn't even sure he thought it anymore. But Jake's words, they felt like sunlight breaking through a storm, warm and undeniable. The days blurred together after that. We spent hours walking through the park, our conversations growing more intimate with each passing moment. Jake had a way of drawing me out, of making me feel like the version of myself I'd almost forgotten. The version that laughed easily, that dreamed without restraint, that wanted more. But with every step closer to Jake, the weight of what we were doing pressed heavier on my shoulders. At night, as I lay beside Michael in the quiet stillness of our bedroom, guilt gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I'd watch him sleep, his face calm and untroubled, and wonder how we'd drifted so far apart. How had we become strangers sharing the same roof? And yet, the thought of pulling away from Jake felt impossible. I'd tell myself to skip the park, to break the pattern before it became something I couldn't undo. But when the time came, my feet carried me there anyway, drawn by a pull I couldn't resist. One evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Jake and I found ourselves by the lake at the edge of the park. The water shimmered with the colors of the setting sun, and the air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers. We sat on the grass, the space between us feeling both too much and not enough. "Sarah," Jake began, his voice quieter than usual. "I know this might sound crazy, but I feel like I've known you forever. Like you understand me in a way no one else does." I turned to him, my heart racing. "Jake." "Let me finish," he said, a faint smile curving his lips. "I know this isn't normal, and I know there are lines we're probably not supposed to cross. But I can't help it. Being with you feels right." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My mind screamed at me to stop, to say something that would put distance between us. But my heart betrayed me, pulling me closer to the edge. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't ignore this either. But it's wrong, Jake. I'm married." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know. And I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to. I just needed you to know how I feel. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the weight of his confession, the intensity of his gaze, and the undeniable truth of my own feelings. I was standing at a crossroads, torn between the life I'd built and the possibility of something new, something unknown. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I realized that there was no easy answer. Only choices and the consequences that came with them. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, though the clouds hadn't yet broken. Jake and I stood beneath the shelter of an old gazebo in the park, the world around us shrouded in a hushed stillness. It felt as though even the earth was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We'd been walking together as usual, our conversation easy, flowing. But this time, there was a tension humming beneath the surface, a tension neither of us acknowledged but couldn't ignore. I felt it in the way he lingered when he looked at me, in the way his hand brushed mine and lingered a beat too long. "It's going to pour any minute," he said, glancing at the sky. His voice was calm, but there was something else there, something I couldn't quite place. "It might hold off," I replied, though my own voice betrayed the uncertainty I felt. We fell into silence, standing side by side beneath the wooden beams of the gazebo. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant chirping of birds. The world felt impossibly large, yet in that moment, it was just the two of us. "Sarah," Jake began, his voice low, hesitant. "There's something I've been wanting to say." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. The look in his eyes stopped me cold. It was unguarded, raw, a mirror of everything I'd been trying to suppress. "I don't want to make this harder for you," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "But I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something for you." My breath caught. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. What could I say? That I felt it too? That I'd been wrestling with the same feelings, fighting the same pull? The truth sat heavy in my chest, pressing against my ribs, begging to be released. "Jake, I started," but my voice faltered. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. The world seemed to narrow, shrinking down to just him, just us. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat louder than the last. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his hand reaching for mine. His fingers brushed against mine, tentative at first, then firmer as I didn't pull away. I needed you to know." The rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, the droplets drumming against the roof of the gazebo. The sound filled the silence between us, a rhythmic backdrop to the moment that was unfolding. I knew I should step back, create distance, but instead, I stayed rooted in place. Jake's hand moved to my face, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from my cheek. His touch was light, careful, as though he was afraid I might shatter. My breath hitched as his eyes met mine, searching, asking a question neither of us dared to voice aloud. And then it happened. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned in. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. When his lips met mine, it was as though the world tilted on its axis. The kiss was soft, tentative, but it carried a weight that felt almost unbearable. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an acknowledgement, a confession, a breaking of everything that had come before. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it. The warmth of his lips, the way his hand cupped my face, the way my heart seemed to burst and quiet all at once. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and utterly wrong. I pulled back, my breath ragged, my mind racing. "Jake, we can't," I began, my voice trembling. "I know," he said quickly, his own voice tight. "I know it's complicated. I know you have responsibilities. But I can't help how I feel." Tears stung at the corners of my eyes. "This isn't fair," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "To you, to me, to anyone." He stepped back, giving me space, though his eyes never left mine. I'm not asking for anything, Sarah, he said. I just, I needed you to know. I needed you to feel it, even just for a moment. The rain continued to pour, the sound enveloping us in a cocoon of isolation. I wanted to say something, anything, to make sense of what had just happened, but the words wouldn't come. When the rain finally began to ease, we parted ways. Jake walked away, his figure disappearing into the misty haze of the park. I stayed behind, my hand brushing my lips, the taste of the moment still lingering. As I made my way home, guilt gnawed at my insides, warring with the undeniable warmth that still radiated through me. I knew I'd crossed a line, one I could never uncross. And yet, for the first time in years, I felt something stir within me, something I wasn't sure I could bury again. The days after the kiss felt like walking a tightrope over an endless void. On one side was the life I had known for years, predictable, stable, yet stifling. On the other was the uncertainty of something new, exhilarating, and dangerous. And in the middle was Jake, pulling me in ways I never thought possible. We didn't talk about the kiss immediately. The next time I saw him, he greeted me with the same warm smile, though his eyes held a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken. I told myself to keep things light, to pretend that nothing had changed. But we both knew better. Our walks grew longer. We ventured further from the familiar paths of the park, exploring hidden corners and shaded trails where the world seemed to fade away. The conversations we once kept safe and surface level now delved into the intimate and vulnerable. Jake shared pieces of himself he'd kept hidden, and in turn, I found myself revealing truths I hadn't spoken aloud in years. "What are you afraid of the most?" he asked one afternoon as we sat on a secluded bench, the sun casting golden light through the trees. The question caught me off guard. I stared at him, the weight of his gaze pressing against the walls I'd built around myself. Losing myself, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I feel like I've spent so much time being what everyone else needs that I don't even know who I am anymore. Jake didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet but firm. "You deserve to find out. To be more than just someone something." I couldn't meet his eyes. Instead, I focused on the way the sunlight danced on the ground, trying to ignore the lump in my throat. We started meeting outside the park. A coffee shop tucked into the corner of a busy street became our refuge. We'd sit at a table near the back, sipping lattes and sharing stolen glances. The thrill of those moments, the way his knee would brush against mine under the table, the way he'd lean in just a little too close, was intoxicating. It made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But the guilt was always there, lurking in the corners of my mind. Every time I returned home, I'd feel its weight pressing down on me. Michael would be in his office or on the couch, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone or laptop. He never asked where I'd been or why I'd been gone so long. His indifference only deepened the ache inside me, making the pull toward Jake even stronger. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, Jake's name appeared on my phone. The message was simple. "Can I see you?" My fingers trembled as I typed my reply. "Where?" "The lake," he wrote. 10 minutes. The lake was our place, a quiet stretch of water surrounded by trees that shielded it from prying eyes. As I approached, the setting sun cast a warm glow over the scene, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Jake was already there, his silhouette outlined against the shimmering water. "You came," he said as I walked toward him. There was relief in his voice, as though he'd feared I wouldn't. "Of course I did," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. We sat on the grass near the water's edge, the world around us quiet and still. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence between us was comfortable, heavy with the things we couldn't say aloud. "This is getting complicated," I said finally, my voice barely audible. Jake turned to look at me, his expression serious. "I know. but I don't want to stop. His honesty was like a knife to the heart. I wanted to tell him that we had to, that this couldn't continue. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I leaned into him, my shoulder brushing against his. His arm wrapped around me, tentative at first, then firmer when I didn't pull away. The lines between right and wrong had long since blurred. I knew I was walking a dangerous path, one that could destroy everything I'd built. But in Jake's presence, the weight of my loneliness lifted, replaced by a warmth that felt impossible to let go. That night, as I lay in bed beside Michael, my mind replayed the moments by the lake. I stared at the ceiling, the guilt and longing warring within me. I knew this couldn't last. Something would have to give. But for now, I clung to the fragile connection I'd found, unable to imagine letting it go. I should have known it would all come crashing down. Secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully you try to hide them. And mine? Mine was no exception. It started with Michael's unexpected early arrival home. I had just returned from another stolen moment with Jake at the lake, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering on my sweater. I barely had time to catch my breath when I heard the front door slam. Michael's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unfamiliar. "Sarah," he called, his tone enough to make my stomach drop. "We need to talk." I found him in the living room, his phone clenched tightly in his hand. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and his eyes, they burned with something I hadn't seen in years. Anger. Hurt. Betrayal. "Who is he?" Michael demanded, holding up his phone. My heart stopped as I recognized the photo on the screen. Jake and me by the lake. Too close. Too intimate. Someone must have seen us, snapped a picture, and sent it to him. The blood drained from my face as the weight of my actions settled fully on my shoulders. "It's not what it looks like," I stammered, the words sounding hollow even to me. Michael's laugh was bitter, sharp. "Really? Because it looks like my wife is sneaking around with someone half her age." I opened my mouth to respond, to explain, but what could I say? That it had started innocently? That I'd been lonely, desperate for something, anything, to remind me I was alive? The excuses felt feeble, even in my own mind. "How long?" he asked, his voice quieter now but no less cutting. "How long have you been lying to me?" The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "A few months," I admitted finally, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Michael." He shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and devastation.
"Sorry?
"You're sorry? Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've destroyed?" The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd betrayed the man who had stood by me for years, who had trusted me, even in our distance. And now, that trust was shattered beyond repair. As Michael stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind him, I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. I had lost control of everything. My marriage was unraveling, and the fragile connection I'd found with Jake now felt like a chain dragging me deeper into chaos. I had no idea how to fix it, or if I even could. They say hindsight is 20/20ths, but in the aftermath of everything, my vision feels sharper than that. Like every mistake, every misstep, is burned into my memory with painful clarity. My life, once so carefully constructed, now lies in ruins around me. And all I can do is sift through the wreckage, trying to make sense of what remains. Michael moved out 2 weeks ago. His absence is a tangible thing, a gaping hole in the fabric of my days. I've told myself it's for the best, that we both need space to figure out what comes next, but the silence of the house is deafening. Each creak of the floorboards, each hollow echo of my footsteps, is a reminder of what I've lost. And Jake? We haven't spoken since the day Michael confronted me. I've thought about reaching out, about explaining everything, but deep down I know it would only make things worse. Whatever connection we shared, it's gone now, tarnished by the chaos it created. What once felt like a lifeline now feels like an anchor, dragging me down. I've spent countless hours replaying the moments that led me here, searching for the turning point, the decision that sealed my fate. Was it the first glance at Jake in the park? The first conversation? The first kiss? Or was it long before that? In the quiet erosion of my marriage, in the slow and steady loss of myself? I used to think loneliness was my enemy, but now I wonder if it was something else entirely. Maybe it was complacency, the way I allowed myself to drift through life without asking for more. I stayed silent when Michael stopped noticing me, convincing myself that stability was enough. I ignored the whispers of discontent, the longing for something deeper, until they became a roar I couldn't ignore. Now, I'm left with the consequences of that silence. The trust I've broken with Michael feels irreparable, though part of me still hopes for forgiveness. Not for the marriage we had, but for the people we used to be. And as for myself, forgiveness feels further away. I've hurt the person I was, the person I wanted to be, more than anyone else. But amid the wreckage, there is something else. A flicker of determination, faint but growing. If I can't undo what's been done, maybe I can learn from it. Maybe I can start to rebuild, not the life I had, but a new one. One built on honesty, on self-awareness, on the understanding that wanting more isn't wrong, but losing yourself to find it is. I've started therapy, a step I should have taken long ago. Talking to someone about the tangled mess of my feelings is uncomfortable, but it's also necessary. I'm learning to sit with my mistakes, to face them head-on instead of burying them beneath layers of denial. It's not easy, and there are days when it feels like too much, but I remind myself that progress isn't a straight line. Michael and I have exchanged a few emails. He's angry, of course, but there's a sadness in his words that cuts deeper than the anger ever could. He said he needs time, and I'm giving it to him, though part of me aches for resolution, for some sign that this chapter isn't entirely closed. As for Jake, I've come to understand that what we had wasn't love, not really. It was a spark, a fleeting moment of connection that felt like salvation in the midst of my despair. But salvation doesn't come from someone else. It has to come from within. And that's the hardest lesson of all. So here I am, standing at the edge of the life I used to know, uncertain of what lies ahead. The road forward feels daunting, but it also feels necessary. I've made mistakes that will follow me for a long time. But I'm learning to live with them, to let them shape me into someone better. Because in the end, that's all we can do, take the broken pieces of ourselves and try to build something new.